Welcome to Voices in Social Work, a Carleton School of Social Work podcast. We discuss important topics in the field of social work and give you the tools to start some new conversations with those around you. We acknowledge that Carleton is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation and are exploring ways to support Indigenous communities who have suffered in order for us to be here and do what we do. Let's get started. Hi everyone, this is episode 3 of our Voices in Social Work podcast. Today I speak to Noah Innes Parchment, who currently works as a program manager for the Untitled Network, which connects and supports 2S LGBTQI service providers across Canada. We talk about what it means to be authentic and true to yourself in your work, how this can be difficult when you're part of a minority or marginalized group, and he shares some advice about how you can help both yourself and the people around you feel more free to be their own unique kind of social worker. I learned a lot from our conversations, and I hope you will too. Okay, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me about authenticity in social work. It's definitely a really interesting topic, and I know one that you and I were saying before that we've had a lot of trouble finding research about it. So thank you for joining me.
Of course, I'm super happy to be here. Thanks, Monica.
Let's start off with, you can maybe describe your job. So what do you do now? Or if you want to talk about things you've done in the past as well.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Noah. My pronouns are he and him. Currently, in terms of what I do for my job, I'm the program manager with the Untitled Network. So with the Untitled Network, I get to support and connect nearly 200 2S LGBTQI groups and organizations across Canada. So that's really exciting work that I get to do nationally. But in the past, I've done a lot of community work. So I'm coming from doing trans healthcare navigation for queer and trans non-binary folks in the Champlain region. So supporting folks in accessing gender-affirming healthcare. I also was a service coordinator for the LGBT Youth Line, where I coordinated and managed provincial 2S LGBTQI helpline for youth. And I also did some program coordination and management for 2S LGBTQI youth in Rexdale. So, you know, if it's not obvious, my passions really lie in supporting 2S LGBTQI communities. And I'm born and raised in Ottawa. So, you know, I went to Carleton, very close to my heart. I'm also currently based in Ottawa, unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. I've been married for 3 years to my beautiful wife. I'm a lover of style and fashion. And I think for me, I came into social work after experiencing homelessness at a very young age. And I really wanted to step into the helping role and support others similarly to how other social work supported me and my family. And then, you know, as I got older, coming into my queer and trans identities, my motivations for the work remained, you know, rooted in some of my experiences when I was younger, but they became stronger when I realized what it means to exist as a Black trans person in North America. So, you know, and I think that more folks who look like me, you know, are really valuable and considered an asset to this work in this field. So that's why I'm just super excited to just touch on the concept of authenticity and like what that looks like and what that means for me.
Thank you. That's a good lead into our questions that you gave a little background on yourself.
Yes.
I'm going to share some research that I found. So our topic is, as we said, authenticity, or we've also talked about how your lived experience can help your social work practice. And it's kind of coming from a place where a lot of times in the social work profession, certain lived experiences aren't considered as valuable, what makes you quote unquote marginalized, and how that can actually really be a strength in your social work practice. So I ended up kind of scouring the internet as much as I could anyway, and I ended up with a lot of research by Brené Brown, which I think a lot of social workers have heard of her. And I had heard of her before we were going to do this podcast, but I had never really thought of her. She is someone who talks about vulnerability, but not in a way that really connected in my brain, where it was also about race. I remember watching videos of her, and I've seen videos of her, and I went back and watched another one, and I noticed the way she speaks is, she does this on purpose, I think, to be more open and to make people feel comfortable, and for research not to be like this thing that is hard to access.
Yeah.
But I did notice when she does that, a lot of the examples that she uses, or even the ways she tries to connect with people, a lot of them are, um, to me, I guess I always take subtle cues from them, like, oh, this isn't like she's not talking to me, or she's not referring to me
Mm,
when she speaks. So that
yeah.
was really interesting for me to notice that for the first time. And so I think as a result, I had never made the connection between her research and race, like my personal thoughts about race, for example, when I'm learning
Hmm.
things.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was really interesting to say, oh, I can actually, like, oh, we're going to apply her research now to our feelings about our race, or our or gender, or other different things.
Yeah.
Um,
No, no, definitely. I'm a bit familiar with Brené's Brown work, but I think it's like the power of vulnerability. Is that like what she
Yes,
talks
that's
about?
what I
Yeah.
found.
Yeah. So I think, when I think about that, and when I think about, being authentic and, the gift and power of approaching this work from lived experience, I think that's very much related to vulnerability. And, it makes me think about things like, makes me think about questions like, who gets to be vulnerable, who gets to be safe being vulnerable in the work, right? And then where is vulnerable sort of like indirectly discouraged for some folks, right? And I think that thinking, when I reflect on those two questions, it kind of like provides some like opportunities to think about, who gets to show up authentically and who experiences challenges to that. So yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll give an overview of some of the stuff that she talks about in her video.
Yeah.
You can find it on YouTube as a TED Talk. It's called The Power of Vulnerability. That video was kind of not meant for social workers or professional social workers necessarily. It's just for people in general and their relationships. But social workers have also applied some of her research, so I'll mention that as well. And we'll see how well you connect to what she's saying, and maybe some similarities, differences, things you feel are left out, and that kind of thing. So in her video called The Power of Vulnerability, she talks about how in order to have connection, we need to get over our shame, or also known as our fear of being seen. And being authentic means what she calls being wholehearted, or believing that you're worthy of connection. She also says that people who are wholehearted people, that she found in her research, they have the courage to be imperfect, and they're kind to themselves first, and then that allows them to be kind to others. And then I found another article on the NASW, the National Association of Social Workers in the States. Their website, they have an article by Angelo McLean, which talks about some ways that that idea of authenticity and vulnerability can be applied in social work. So some of those are letting go of shame. So kind of what we were talking about. It's hard to be real with other people when you're ashamed of who you are and what you believe. Another one is recognizing when to share and when to remain silent. So you don't have to, being vulnerable doesn't mean spilling your entire life story to your client all the time.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good one.
Um, and another one is, this is a little bit related, but setting healthy boundaries. So letting people know what's okay and what's not okay in your relationship.
Yes.
Another one is let go of who you think you're supposed to be. So not being held back by comparison to others or perfectionism, not measuring up to whatever standard you have in yourself as well.
Hmm.
And just says let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. So that's part of authenticity. And the last one that I found was that authenticity is really essential to compassion. So that's kind of what Brené Brown was talking about as well. So you have to, you need it to make a real connection with somebody else and with your clients. Um,
Amazing.
yeah. So based on that research, what do you think it means to you to be authentic as a social worker, and why do you think it's important? Do you connect to those things that were said in the research?
Yes, I definitely do connect to those things that were said in the research, especially around the concept of letting go who you think you are, and not succumbing to like those pressures around like conformity. Whatever you're engaging with, like what does this standard, like what's the standard, or like how does this generally look, right? Not giving into that and being yourself. I think that really resonated for me. And I think for me, to be authentic is to be honest, and is to show up for yourself as much or more than you show up for others, right? So for me, it's about being honest about my capacity to show up and care for others. It's about exploring what I might need in order to do that as well. So for me, I think the social work field can be so vast and it can encompass so much. And so being authentic has allowed me to sort of like investigate my motivations for engaging in social work. It allows me to ask questions like, why am I doing this? What do I need to feel supported? What feels good about the work? What doesn't? And so, yeah, in my opinion, like remaining true to myself as a social worker allows opportunities for growth. So for personal and professional growth, betterment. And I also think it helps me in determining, my lane in this field, what kind of work I do in this field, and, what it looks like and what it feels like for somebody who looks like me to be doing this work, for sure.
So that's a good segue into our next question, I think. So, what are some of the reasons why maybe you found it hard to be authentic as a social worker in the past? And is there anything that encouraged you to persevere through that?
For me, I think it goes back to the research that you were mentioning again around kind of like letting go of what you think you should be and just being. That has been something that has been a bit of a challenge for me, right? So I think for me as a Black transgender person, always like showing up as my authentic self can be challenging sometimes. For me, when I show up as my full self, I have to potentially worry about things like transphobia, homophobia, racism. Just like I have to reflect on how these things might impact my experience. And I think for me, worrying about these things sometimes causes me to shrink parts of myself to fit in. So I'm directly doing that thing, as the research mentioned, of like really trying to make the work that I do look more in line with what my white counterparts are doing, with my non-Black counterparts are doing, right? And I think in doing that, that kind of like waters down who I really am. And that doesn't allow like all parts of myself to show up in the work that I do.
Do you have any specific examples about the difference that you can see?
First, I think what I'll touch on is kind of like what has encouraged me to kind of like persevere through that. And I have an example.
Okay.
So I think what's encouraged me to persevere is kind of knowing what can happen in the quote unquote therapeutic relationship between me and folks accessing any services that I'm working at, that I'm volunteering at, that I'm engaging in social work at, right? I think something really magical and really, again, therapeutic and transformational can happen when we do show up as our authentic selves. And a really great example of this is I was working with somebody, and this person was Black as well. And they shared many other identities with me. On our last interaction together, they said, "Hey, Noah, seeing you gives me motivation to keep going and to be myself." Right. And there's a lot of things we can do as social workers in terms of wellness planning and just kind of like writing out really concrete and practical plans for folks in moving forward and empowering themselves and supporting themselves. But me supporting this person and working alongside this person, just being who I am and showing up authentically, and for them to respond like just seeing you and working with you gives me the motivation to keep going. I think that's a really great statement on the importance of authenticity in the work, right? If I were to water down any parts of myself in that interaction with that client, they might not have been, seeing me and seeing who I am, and then knowing that they can also push through some of the things that they're struggling with, given that we're sharing some of those identities, right? There's like a way to be on as a social worker. We can turn on all of our approaches and our theories, and those are good and those ground us, and that's the foundation of the work. But just showing up as yourself, laughing, joking, making light of things, and being professional at the same time, I think can really be helpful. So
I think people can tell, right, when you're trying to be somebody else, you're trying to fit into whatever maybe the therapy is trying to tell you to be instead of
Exactly.
being you.
Exactly. And I think for me, coming from a community of color, some of these concepts that we do learn through academia can be very influenced and informed by Western education, by Western norms, by Western society. And so there's nothing wrong with that at all times, but sometimes using those tactics or using those frameworks don't always land well with communities of color, because again, we're approaching it from a Western perspective and standpoint. So, for me as a Black person, I'm going to use those frameworks, but I'm also going to use what I know, what it means for me to be a Black person and interact with other Black folks, and what it might look like for my communities to feel comfortable in a space, and what that might look like, and what kind of things need to be said, and what kind of the tone that needs to kind of like be present. And that kind of like for me exists outside of like theory and frameworks that we might learn in academia for sure.
So we talked about theories. I don't know if you have any specific examples or other examples that are therapeutic approach related for maybe ways that you have felt a little bit of pressure to be something that you're not.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So I can think of many, many experiences, but one that pops up into my head was I was working in an agency and they had very strict rules around kind of like attending programs. So, folks would have to like come in at a certain time, or like the doors would be locked and you wouldn't be able to access programming kind of thing. This program was also a program that was encouraging the presence and attendance and fostering a safer space for people of color and Black folks as well, right? Quickly I learned, and this was also a program for young people, and quickly I learned that, young people really enjoyed showing up to the program and coming to the space, but the rule around time and not being able to access the programming if they were to come a certain amount of time after the program started doesn't work, right? I had a lot of conversations with the youth, and they didn't use this language, but basically, time is a colonial concept, right? I was working, a few of these youth that I can think of are newcomers, right? So the way that they approach time and showing up to like leisure or recreation is not how we might experience it here in like Canada or North America, right? 10 minutes late to something is actually not you coming late. Like that's you coming on time, right? And so for me, it was the balance of respecting the agency's like policies and procedures, but also honoring that these policies and procedures can feel colonial to youth who are coming from a certain place, right? So being a bit flexible, me coming from where I'm coming from, I know concepts around time and coming on time can be challenging for a lot of communities who are coming from a lot of different places. So being cognizant of that and knowledgeable about that and trying to challenge that and push that wherever I can, but also being flexible around rules that exist like that for sure.
For people that are maybe where you were, struggling to be more authentic in their social work practice, do you have any advice that you would like to give them? Maybe some concrete steps or actions that they can take as well, like small steps, even if that's
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I think that first of all, what I want to say is that I think that it's always an asset in this field when folks are coming to the work, from different lived experiences. And that can like be so vast and so many. And I think for me, when I think about anybody who might be experiencing some challenges in showing up as their authentic selves, it's just to acknowledge the circumstances under which you have to show up as your authentic self. So again, I speak a lot from my perspective as like a Black transgender person, right? A lot of the things that I struggle with are rooted in systems and institutions that don't necessarily are rooted in an individual, but again, in systems and institutions, these things are really hard and slow to change. And so for me, just that acknowledgement and recognizing that it is ideal that I do show up as my authentic self, but what are the circumstances that make it hard for me to show up as my authentic self, especially in comparison to maybe some folks where, you're just watching them just like excel and flourish, and maybe they're not experiencing a lot of pushback or consequence from being their authentic self, right? So just thinking about the circumstances under which we have to work, just kind of like acknowledging that and naming that, I think is first. And then I think a lot about folks continuing to explore and think about doing this work and how it makes you feel, and why you want to keep doing this work, right? Just kind of like that self-reflection around like why you're here, why you want to do it, who you're doing it for is super important in being authentic. And I think that those questions can be asked at different periods of your journey through your career and through the field. So it's not something that you only have to ask yourself like straight at the beginning of like when you're kind of like starting the work. I think it's a question that periodically there should be moments of reflection around like why you're here, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. I think too, when I think about authenticity, I think a lot about how, not to open another can of worms.
Go ahead, go
but
open the can.
I think a lot about how I definitely have colleagues who are burnt out, but who are not being authentic in that, who are really pushing through the burnout for very valid reasons. They're continuing to do the work. They're getting support for themselves, but they're burnt out, right? And I think that's a huge reality for a lot of folks in the field. If you're struggling to be authentic, recognize like, are you feeling burnt out? Do you need a break? And, if those things are true, being a part of being authentic is learning and knowing when to take a break and sort of like knowing, when it's time to create space for others to step up and maybe do that work from a different perspective too.
That's a great way to think about it with burnout. Like,
yeah,
not even just a lived experience from your past, but also what you're experiencing right now, right?
exactly.
Great.
Exactly. I always think about, for myself, showing up as my authentic self means that, some of the statistics that I see about Black folks, about trans folks, I'm not exclusive from those statistics. So if 2021 was the deadliest year on record for trans folks, like that statistic, I'm not removed from that statistic, right? And so I think a part of being authentic too is recognizing that depending on where you're coming from and how you're approaching the work, some of the things that we're supporting folks around, we also need support around. We're not kind of removed from those narratives around oppression and how that can manifest. Always just kind of like being mindful of that and knowing that oftentimes there's like a power balance that exists when we think about like the social worker and the client or the service user, right? But it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes the social worker, their experience is not far off from the quote unquote client. So like recognizing and rooting yourself in that and knowing that that's what you're working from for sure.
And I wanted to go back a little bit to the idea of the therapeutic approaches,
Yeah.
because I think that's going to be tough, like for a lot of social workers. If you're doing counseling, that's kind of what you rely on for your competence. Like that's all you've learned how to do,
Yeah.
right? And it's what makes you a professional. Do you still use therapeutic approaches based on Western research, North American research, European research? And then does that mean that you change or modify them somehow for yourself?
I'll kind of speak generally because the work that I'm currently doing is not very much frontline or therapeutic work that I'm doing, but I do have a lot of experience engaging in that work. And I think that, those concepts and those frameworks and those theories that we use, again, are foundational to the work that we do. And I think that there's a lot of good in them and they help keep our interactions with folks who are accessing services like they keep them safer. They allow for like boundaries and they allow for relationships to progress without any conflicts or anything like that. So I want to kind of preface with that. And I think that there are many ways that folks can kind of like show up and implement a bit of themselves while using those frameworks and those theories, right? So in my opinion, before anybody kind of like went to school or read any books or watched any videos on any social work theories, frameworks, approaches, they were human beings first, right? We were human beings with the desire to help people before we learned all of this stuff. And I know for me, I just know I wanted to help people, right? And before I started my Bachelor of Social Work, I was just like a little snobby 17-year-old who was like, I'm already volunteering and I'm already helping people. Why do I need a degree to do it? If you're feeling like these theories or these frameworks are really rigid, there's different ways. I'm struggling to think of like concrete examples. I've been in a position where, for example, I'm doing intakes and there's a certain amount of questions or things or an amount of clients that I have to get through in a day, in a month in order to like meet organizational mandates and quotas, et cetera, right? It's very challenging. The caseload was a lot. And I think for me, that's something that I had to do. But I think that if I was meeting with a client who would have rather talked about something that was really relevant for them today, a random example, honestly, is like I spent about like 10 minutes of an intake meeting talking about a movie. that was really important to a client. And I think that's kind of like obvious, but I'm more so trying to speak to the idea that things can go off the rails. And although you're not meeting that quota, or you're thinking like, I don't know how my manager or my boss is going to feel about this, something really therapeutic and transformational can happen if we let clients lead interactions, if we let clients kind of like talk about what they want to talk about. I actually, when I access therapy, right? There was a therapist that I met with years ago. And when I'm talking with her and when I'm sharing a hard story, she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetie." Right. And so she used the term sweetie. And like, that's not a term that as a social worker that I would ever use. But when she used that towards me, I felt a bit more comfortable in opening up to her and talking to her, because I felt like she was just she heard what I was saying and she was seeing me. And her response in calling me sweetie was like kind of like grounded in like our culture and like trying to help me feel comfortable. And I bring up that example because maybe, some workers might be uncomfortable using like jargon or like pet names like sweetie. I'm not encouraging anybody to say that, but more so saying that, if there's different like terms, slang, language, cultural things that are relevant to folks that we're working with, we can implement those into like the Western ways that we think about things and approach things as well.
If it's really natural to you, people are going to be able to tell. And if it's not natural, they're also going to be able to tell. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I can add a few more things as well
Oh,
on some
sure.
some stuff about advice.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, because I've just been kind of thinking as well. And I think for me, when folks are accessing support, so like when social workers, when folks in the field are accessing support, as much as you can, things like therapy, supervision, get that from folks who come from your experience, who look like you. It's been challenging for me to find like a Black transgender person where I can access like peer-to-peer support or supervision. But when I have access to that kind of support, I noticed how helpful it was to talk through some challenging times and issues that I was kind of like dealing with, and talking to somebody who might get it a bit more was always helpful.
Do
Yeah.
you think that helped you do better work or be more authentic in your work with
Yes,
clients?
absolutely. Especially the role of like a therapist or a clinical supervisor, knowing somebody who looks like me, has, worked in this capacity for many years before I did, just gave me so much confidence to know that like, I'm approaching this well, is what I'm doing okay. And that I could actually like make and carve a way for myself in the field, for sure. I know Laverne Cox talks about possibility models. So it's this concept that just by folks existing as who they are, it allows others to kind of like see that and then believe that they can now step into that role. Because I'm existing, it's possible for you to exist. So Laverne Cox talks about that in the way of representation of Black trans women. So she sees herself as a possibility model for other Black trans women, like, because I did it, you can do it too. And I think that's a really great model, especially when I think about social work. I see people who do look like me, but, there's not lots of people who look like me. So when I do encounter those folks are possibility models for me. And they allow me to see that, I can be in this field. I can work in this field from the perspective that I'm working in. It's valued and it's important as well. And getting that feedback has been always super important to me, for sure.
I think I felt a little bit of that where it kind of gives you a little boost, like, oh, I know I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It can be really isolating and hard to just kind of like look around and see nobody who might be coming from an experience or a place that you're coming from. So always having that is helpful for me.
Thinking
Always.
about the concept of modeling, which we do learn about, being able to model behavior for your client.
Yeah.
And that sounds like it's pretty similar.
Yeah.
So do you think that still applies when, let's say, your client's white?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it could apply if your clients are white.
I think people can still tell when you're trying to not be yourself. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's harder to tell if like it's a different experience.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I've never, I don't think I've ever felt disconnection in terms of like my experiences or my approach when working with white clients. I felt a lot of appreciation. But yeah, no, I'm just kind of like thinking and reflecting on that question. Like, what does that look like? Because when I think about authenticity for myself and I think about working with white communities, I think about the times when as like a social worker, I've experienced some indirect microaggressions or some discriminatory comments and how I was not able to be authentic in those moments. I've worked with folks who are like have complex mental health as well. And sometimes that complex mental health can manifest as like racist and derogatory comments towards me, who's kind of like an enemy at any moment kind of thing. And so in those moments, I don't feel like I can be like super authentic. But I think for me, it's just kind of like remembering when folks are struggling, sometimes this is how things manifest. And again, like afterwards, getting support for myself around that. But it's always just been, at least in accessing support for myself when a client is being racist towards me, it's always just been a very interesting experience that doesn't lead too much. It's always sort of been like, this is a mental health issue with this person, and so we have to just accept it. And I think that it's just unfortunate that sometimes that mental health can manifest in that way, in like a offensive and hateful way. It's a reality that I've faced many times, especially when working with folks with complex mental health, that like, you know, when they're in psychosis or when there's something going on, like that's the first thing that might come out of their mouth. And so
We were talking about that NASW article before. I was talking about boundaries and not sharing everything, especially when it's not helpful. That can be part of being authentic looks like in that moment, right?
yeah, I think that is a very good point because, in my opinion, we can also look at authenticity as preserving your energy, depending on where you're coming from in this work, whether it's from clients or folks accessing services or colleagues or anybody that we have to interact with as we're kind of like navigating career spaces. One can say it's inevitable that, you know, again, depending on where you're coming from, that discrimination, microaggressions, racism, the different things that you can experience as a marginalized person, those are likely to be frequent occurrences. I know for me, they are frequent occurrences. But what being authentic in those moments looks like for me is preserving my energy. So if somebody does say something problematic, you know, even though in my authenticity, it's for me to address because I feel very strongly about things like that being said, sometimes I choose just to be quiet about it. Sometimes I choose to laugh about it, especially if the joke is affecting me. I don't have a lot of energy sometimes to like address every single thing that happens. So sometimes authenticity is learning how to take care of yourself afterwards, hearing something really hurtful, maybe laughing it off, maybe being shocked and freezing in that moment and knowing that's okay. Get support for yourself afterwards, connect with your peers. Protecting your heart is also very authentic and it's needed, you know, in order to get through the field for sure.
I know one thing I think I read in the research too is there is that misconception that if you're vulnerable or authentic, it means that you're sharing what you're thinking and feeling all of the time. But sometimes that can, in situations where that's not helpful, then you're not necessarily trying to make connection with someone and be vulnerable. It's kind of more about you than it is about you and that
Yes.
person together.
Yes, yes. And that's a very good point and something that I wanted to bring up because one thing that I remember learning in my academic journey is around disclosures about ourselves as workers and when is appropriate to do that and when is inappropriate to do that or when we should pass. And I don't ever think it's appropriate for us to like be vulnerable and disclose parts of ourselves for no reason at all, right? And I know for me, I only do that where it would be in support of the person that I'm supporting, and it would help them feel empowered and it would help them feel motivated and it would help us have a better therapeutic interaction or relationship. I can think of a really good example. Again, I was working in trans healthcare and somebody was on the phone with me and they were very angry because they wanted me to support them in finding another doctor. Their doctor is apparently just like racist and like all these things, talked a lot about how like, you know, racism manifests in the medical system and how exhausted they were from it and the different things that they were struggling through to sort of like get care for themselves. They were just really, really, really angry and asking me a lot of questions. And then they said something that implied that because we were over the phone, they said something that implied that I was just another white person here to like make their systems navigation harder, right? And that was the moment for me where it was now appropriate to disclose that I am Black. This person can't see me. This person doesn't know who I am. And I am still complicit in a lot of the things they're talking about because I'm working in this clinic. But I think it's in that moment, it was very important for me to say I'm Black. And as soon as I said that, like their tone and the yelling went down. like from 100 to 0. And we had a really good conversation about what their experiences have been. By the end of the call, they said that they felt a lot better about our plan and moving forward. I just really noticed like a shift in how we were talking to each other and how we were interacting after I did that little disclosure, right? And so for me, I only think that it's very helpful to do those things when it would help that interaction with the client, right? So being very mindful of boundaries, I think it's super, super important. A part of this work is be authentic, but it's also about protecting ourselves. It's just trying to figure out ways to do that.
Yeah, it's like a fine line to walk, right? And I
Yeah,
guess it's also about like not pretending that there's no kind of professional relationship there or that you're not
yeah,
meeting under the circumstances of somebody seeking your professional help.
exactly. Really being mindful and respectful of the professional standards that hold us, but finding our authenticity in that. Yeah, that's like the whole
Yay.
thesis statement of the podcast.
Is there anything that you've done in the past or that you think maybe just helps people around you, maybe colleagues? What do you think are things that someone can do to help them feel more free to be more of their authentic self? I know we talked about the possibility modeling.
Yeah,
Is there anything else that maybe you've done in the past or you've seen or that people have done for you?
I think if everybody allows folks like the space and the opportunity to get to know your colleagues and like get to know who's working with you and who's around you is like super, super important. A lot of like active listening is super, super important. Again, like, you know, when for me, feeling very isolated or being the only person who might look like me, what that's done to me in the past has made me water myself down or made me kind of like want to conform to maybe the more standard or general way of approaching this work, right? And this is just very hard to think about in the virtual context. But I know for me, sharing meals with like colleagues and like engaging in like informal spaces. So like lunchtime breaks, little opportunities to like talk to my colleagues so they know more about who I am. I know more about who they are. I think for me, allowed me to kind of like be more authentic and become comfortable being authentic because in kind of like sharing space with my colleagues and like just chatting informally about like life and like work and like etc. just allows me to like humanize my colleagues. They humanize me. And, you know, I think that allows both of us to continue showing up to the work authentically. And the more I share on that like colleague level about like who I am, it allows me to now just gives myself permission to like be who I am because I'm sharing who I am, if that makes sense. So like a lot of communication and dialogue and the spaces and the opportunities to create that dialogue. I know in one of my workplaces, what was really helpful for me is like forming a peer group. We were a group of like people of color who are also mostly queer and trans. And we just formed an informal like lunch group where we kind of like got together and chatted and like talked about the work and like what we're up to in life. And, you know, in an agency where we were like one of the 5 or 6 folks who looked like us, it was really helpful to have that space, right? And then when we are not in that space, we can just know who to call to for support, you know, who our peers were. So yeah, just really carving out your space in that workplace if you can, and finding the support internally and externally, I think can really help in being your authentic self.
And then when you go back to work, even if they're not there with you, it still feels like you're less alone, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I want to name how it's important to show up as your authentic self because like you mentioned, like folks can tell, you know, when we're not, but I also think it's not always easy to do so. And I want to name that. And so I'm encouraging folks to show up as their authentic selves, but I'm also encouraging folks to like have boundaries, do things that feel good for you. And also like, remember that you matter in this work. You're important to this work. And the fact that you want to do this like means something. And so just always taking time to like investigate that and show up for yourself as much as you can. Showing up for others means that you have to show up for yourself as much as you do others. So
You
yeah,
elaborate a little on showing up for yourself?
yeah. I think showing up for yourself can be very deep, but like it also can be doing something like journaling, going for walks, making sure you're eating your meals and you're taking meal breaks, accessing therapy. Again, if therapy is not your jam, accessing whatever form of support would feel good for you to keep going and keep balanced and keep kind of like grounded in the work. You know, supervision, peer groups, whatever you would need, all the work that we do in supporting others, we should be doing as much work on ourselves too. As hard as that could be sometimes, it's so important in order for us to kind of like show up, for others. I don't know about you, but like I have so many friends where, and myself included, where that's not the first thing I'm always thinking about. Like I'm very bad at self-care, but I also have learned through my experience how important it is, to like do things like address burnout, and to like think about like sustainability in the work for sure.
Okay. I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Voices in Social Work. We hope you now have something new to talk about or explore. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at sswpodcast@carleton.ca. You can also visit voicesinsocialwork.podbean.com to see our full list of episodes and links to all of the ways you can listen to us. See you next time.